And let's start. Beautiful, beautiful OBS. And back to Russell. So, quick rehash. Where did we start? We were thinking about the meanings of descriptions. And there's two types of descriptions. There were indefinite ones, which was something like a man, or a tiger, or an American. And Russell tried to make the case that, hey, and that's what we were doing in the previous slides, whatever those are, they're not going to work like names. Instead, they work kind of like gappy propositions. Just to go back a slide, they're gappy propositions that we can then fill in either by adding a name or by using propositional functions. Some, all, none, every, etc., etc. Then it gives us a full-blown proposition. So much for indefinite. What about definite descriptions? Well, definite descriptions function really differently. Because what do definite descriptions do? Well, they take us, in some sense, to a particular object. The author of Waverley. Does anyone know who the author of Waverley actually is? Does anyone even know what Waverley is? Yeah, good. It was super huge in Victorian times, and then it kind of went away. So it's a fictional novel written by Walter Scott. It's a name that I imagine many of you don't even know who that is. But that's great, because you know exactly that there's some kind of meaning there. When I say the author of Waverley, just by the structure of the expression, you know what it's meant to be doing. It's meant to take us to the one and only one entity that wrote the book Waverley. Whatever the hell that is. And whoever the hell that is. So here's how we can understand it, according to Russell. If we take the author of Waverley as Scottish, well, it's got two basic parts. It's got the author of Waverley, and it's saying of that thing, it's Scottish. You might be tempted to think, cool, it's just subject-predicate form. But that's not going to work, and that's not going to work for issues we talked about with Frege. The present king of France is bald. Same structure. But that first part don't seem to pick nothing out in the present king of France. So we don't want to just treat this definite description, or all definite descriptions, as purely directly denoted. Instead, we're going to use this stuff that we learned about indefinite descriptions to help us out here. So definite descriptions are just like the indefinite ones, in that they're kind of like gappy propositions. But they're gappy propositions that are kind of filled in as well. So here's how we can think about it. What does the author of Waverley as Scottish say? Three things. It says that something wrote Waverley, or X wrote Waverley, is not always false. Or, to put this another way, is sometimes true. There's somebody you can plug in here that will make the embedded thing true. Similarly, it says if there's an object you can fill in for X and for Y, such that they both wrote Waverley, then they must be the same thing. And finally, it says if whatever it is we've just talked about, if that thing wrote Waverley, then that thing must be Scottish. That is, there's some object, and in fact not just some, but every object we can fill in for X, which will make this conditional true. So let's unpack it. What does this basically tell us? It says there's at least one thing that wrote Waverley. For any two things, if they both wrote Waverley, then they're the exact same thing. And whatever it is that wrote Waverley also happens to satisfy the predicate is Scottish. Or, to put it another way, at least one person wrote the book, at most one person wrote the book, and whoever wrote it is Scottish. And here's Walter Scott. the man who wrote Waverley. Or, well, a picture of it. Thank you. So we can capture this using our logical notation. And this kind of helps us tie back to the stuff we were talking about a second ago with indefinite descriptions. Because basically, the author of Waverley embeds several indefinite descriptions along the way. The first one is indefinite. It says there's an author of Waverley. Something wrote this book. Our second premise says, hey, for everything, but this should say for all x and all y, if x wrote it and y wrote it, then they're the same damn thing. And then finally, we'll just kind of use the same object and we'll say, of that thing, it is Scottish. Sticking them all together, we get a sentence like this. So what does this actually say? It says, there is something such that it wrote Waverley, and for anything, if it wrote Waverley, it's identical to our first thing, and the thing we've been talking about is a Scot. In other words, we use our quantifier, our propositional function, to give us a complete sentence. And this complete sentence, by its structure, gets us to one and only one object. Really, the thing that's doing all the heavy lifting here is the first one. These first two conjuncts. This tells us there's at least one thing that W's, and this tells us there's at most one thing that W's. So there's only one. Exactly one. Nice. The building is taking off again. So before we go on, it's important to see, do we see how the structure of the sentence is doing the heavy lifting here? And similarly, how this is really close to the stuff we were just doing a second ago. Again, the only way this works is by filling it in, by having the propositional function. That's a fancy way of saying by having the quantifier in front. So what's the meaning of a definite description? Kind of a bad question. Here's what it does. It gives you one of these, which you can then use. That's its meaning. So it's not like a name, in that it doesn't get you to a reference. Instead, it gives you a proposition, which is then going to be, in some sense, about something or not. Okay. Cool. Make sense? So, here's the big thing. Definite descriptions, like the F, aren't names. They are not names. They're singular terms, that is, they in some sense denote one and only one object, but they are very different than names like Aristotle. Here's one. They have different logical forms. According to Russell, names are logically simple, whereas definite descriptions are not. Indeed, we just talked about their logical structure. We know that they always have at least two parts. They say there's at least one and at most one. Names, for Russell, are, as he puts them, simple symbols, whose meaning can only occur as a subject. So we could never have Aristotle occurring as anything other than as a subject in a subject-predicate sentence, according to Russell. Contrast that with the author of Waverley. It's not a simple symbol, because it has logical parts. Go back a slide, we express at least this way, with those first two clauses. It's a logical complex that we built up using quantifier expressions and predicates. So it's not like names. And in fact, you can kind of see it if you remember back to, again, non-flashbacks for some people, I'm sure, if we think about how we did names in first-order logic. Do we remember how we expressed names in first-order logic? Lots of shaking hands. Cool. So we express names with just lowercase letters. And we had some stipulations. Our stipulations were that there were no empty names, right? Every name that we had definitely picked out one and only one object in our domain. So here's Russell's trick. This is logically simple. There's no getting kind of smaller than that. Whereas that is obviously not logically simple. That features quite a few things. Quantifier, conjunction, conditional, identity, pretty logically complex. That's the first point. Here's the second point about how they're different, according to Russell. Names and definite descriptions have radically different logical behavior. So here's another thing if we remember back to logic. So when we did natural deduction, way back. Yeah. Terrifying expression. The second half of the course, we talked about constructing proofs. And one of the things we could do, there was a very special introduction rule for identity. The introduction rule for identity is we can always, no matter what, introduce an identity claim with the same name on both sides. Doesn't matter the name. So here's the trick. These expressions are a priori, analytic, and the big one, only expressible if these actually pick something out. If they don't, if the name we try to use doesn't pick anything out, we can't even say this. It would just be kind of, we don't even make noise. We say nothing. So A equals A, whatever the hell A is, we do not care, logically is always true. Contrast that with the F is the F. That is contingent. It might be true, and it might be false. Why? Why is the F possibly false? Yeah. Cool. Right? So let's put that in terms of the quantifier. Right? So what does this basically tell us? The F is the F says something like this. I'm just going to put this in full notation because it'll be easier for us to read. There's at least one thing that's an F. And on the Z, everything that is an F is identical to our X. And there's at least one thing Y that's an F. Okay, fancy way of saying there's at least one X that's F. And everything that's F is identical to X. And There's at least one thing y that's f, and everything that's f is identical to it. Now, how can this sentence fail? Lots of ways. The easiest one, there ain't no f's. If there ain't no f's, our existentials fail and the sentence is false. Another way is, there's more than one f. Then this would fail. So there's multiple ways for the f is the f to come out false. But according to Russell, there is literally no way for us to be able to say A is A and it to come out false. Have a different logical behavior. That's really cool. But no, it puts a hell of a lot of restrictions on what can be a name. That only works if there can never be empty names. And that only works if names are real transparent. That is, they tell you nothing at all about what it is they name. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. Here's the last thing. The difference between definite descriptions and names. They mean something different. Names, for Russell, just mean they're referent. You can go straight through them just to get to whatever the hell they refer to. Definite descriptions, nah. Definite descriptions mean, as he puts it, the value for x that makes x's f true. That's a terrible, terrible, terrible way. Absolutely opaque, doesn't help. Better way to think about it is, what do they mean? They mean this function. And that function happens to only be satisfied by one thing, if it's satisfied at all. But they mean, hey, you can fill these in with something. Don't know who it is, but with somebody. That's what we mean. So it gets us to a single object, but it does it via this propositional function. Do we see the difference? Another way to put it is, names are a little bit just like very straightforward directions. You go immediately to where you want to go. This one is the worst possible Google directions, where it takes you through a very complex roundabout way. Eventually you get to where you want. Okay. Cool. So fine. Definite descriptions. They look a hell of a lot like names. They're singular terms. They pick out particular objects. They do not refer. Instead, it's better to say, they denote. That is, they kind of get us to single objects, but not directly. Reference is just for names. That's the view. We have these funny story about descriptions. How in the hell is this supposed to help us with the puzzles that we started with? Here's the first thing. Remember one of the objections we had to Frege. The present king of France is bald. The present king of France is not bald. We said, hey, this is weird. Because if we look out in the world, well, he's not in the bald things, he's not in the not bald things. What the hell's going on here? Russell's solution is to say, cool, note, these feature definite descriptions. So the trick here is primary versus secondary occurrence. The primary occurrence is when the relevant definite description, the relevant propositional function, has what we might think of as wide scope. That is, the existential is the one that controls the whole sentence. So you could read one as saying, there's something that's the present king of France. And everything that's the present king of France is identical to that one thing. Oh, and that thing is bald. And this will be true or false depending on if we can satisfy that expression, if we can find something to plug in for x. Another way to understand 2 is it's basically the same thing, with one subtle difference. It says there's at least one present king of France. Anything that's the present king of France is identical to that thing, and it's not the case that that thing is bald. Note this, just like the one above it, is driven by the existential. Both of them will be false if, for example, there is no present king of France, if there's no K. But let's look at our secondary occurrence. Our secondary occurrence of the definite description, it's scoped over. There's some other operator. In this case, it's a negation. It says it's not the case that there's something that's a present king of France and everything that's a present king of France is identical to it and it's bald. Here's the neat thing. If 1 is false, that reading of 2 is true. Meanwhile, if 1 is false, this reading of 2 can still be false. Why? Because the existential fails in both cases. The difference is the scope of the negation. Or, to put it in fancy terms, the difference is whether we're reading it with a primary occurrence, that is, the kind of existential comes to the fore, or as a secondary occurrence, that is, it's inside some other function, a negation, say. Do we get the difference between the primary and the secondary? It's easy to see with the negation, but note it doesn't have to be just a negation. It could be anything. So, for example, it might be a Nathan believes that. And we can push the quantifier out in the front or embed it inside a believes that operator. Exactly how we understand that might be debatable. But again, we can think about the scope there, moving around. And as long as we can get that grip on the difference in scope, you've got it. So we can have the law of excluded middle as long as we're careful about which sentence it is that this actually expresses. English sucks. Logic is nicer. It's clearer. What about some of our other puzzles? So remember, we had a problem about negative existentials. Well, let's think about an example. The present king of France doesn't exist. How can you read that? Well, you can read it either with a primary occurrence or a secondary occurrence. That is, you can read it as saying, there's something that's a present king of France, for everything that's a present king, it's identical to that first thing. Oh yeah, and that thing has the property of non-being. Not so good. Here's a different one. It's not the case that there's something that satisfies final description. If we understand what's going on in the secondary way, bingo. Not only is it understandable, but it's fucking true. One up on Frege. Because remember, Frege just said, oh, I can make sense of it. But now we can get it to come out true, which is what you might think we should be able to do. That's nice. Same thing, right? We talked about the present king of France. Cool. What happens if we use proper names? Here is Russell's big, deep, dark trick. And this is where the whole Russellian program goes to. Whenever we use proper names, 99.99999% of the time, it's not actually a proper name. It's a definite description. He talks about in terms of Homer in the paper that we read. When we ask whether Homer existed, we're using the word Homer as an abbreviated description. Something like the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The same considerations apply to almost all uses of what look like proper names. In other words, most proper names, nah, they're concealed definite descriptions. So when I say Odysseus doesn't exist, what am I really saying? I'm saying it's not the case that there's something that satisfies the Odysseus definite description. It might be because there's none. It might be because there's multiple. Of course, you might wonder what exactly goes into the O here. That should be familiar. That's very similar to the first problem we talked about with Frege. Remember, way back at the start, talked about it wasn't clear what goes into the sense of Aristotle. We wanted the sense of Aristotle to be something like a description that got us the particular individual. Cool, same thing here. We got to figure out what's in the definite description. But here's the neat thing. Even if we don't know it, we can still say that's what it is. So not only do we make sense now of apparent talk of non-existent objects, we can get them to come out true or false, dependent, by forcing what look like names into concealed descriptions. Same thing. Meaningful talk about non-existence. Odysseus was Greek. We can just read this as a concealed definite description. The thing that is Odysseus, the thing that is the Odysseus, is Greek. And this is going to come out false. But it's not going to come out false because Odysseus wasn't Greek, he was Macedonian. No. It comes out false because nothing satisfies the description. Again, a leg up on Frege. Remember, Frege says these kinds of sentences are neither true nor false. But now we've given them a truth value. It's false. Odysseus is not one of the Greeks. He doesn't exist. Cool so far? Making sense? Again, the big trick, the big trick. Let's go back one. Is this. We're going to be able to read almost all occurrences of names as concealed definite descriptions. And once we do that, we can use this move about scope to have the sentences come out with truth values. They can be false, or if they're negative existentials, they can be true. Here's the last one, the last puzzle. The substitution stuff that we had on the board a second ago. Lois believes that Superman can fly. True. Lois believes that Kent can fly. False. How can we make sense of why one is true and the other is false? Well, we can kind of copy Frege. The thing that's in the inside of the that clause are different. Right? The propositions in here are different in the two cases. But they're not different because they are different Fregean thoughts. Those are creepy, says Russell. It's different because they have different constituents. That is, the embedded propositions literally have different logical structure. And here's why. These names are different definite descriptions.
But I don't understand how that exactly differs from saying that the sense of Superman and Clark Kent is different.
Good. So note what we've never had to say is that there are anything like senses.
Okay.
All we have to believe in are propositional functions. We need to be able to re-express the sentence using quantifiers and things like this. If we can, we've got meaning. We don't have to believe in abstract entities that are meanings. That's the big trick. So it's one way to think about it is it's like the calorie light version of Frege. Frege's the full sugar soda. Russell's trying to give us the same taste, but without having to commit to senses. That's what we want. That's what Russell wants. So that's the really neat trick. We managed to avoid a bunch of the problems that Frege had. And we've done it by basically saying, hey, names are concealed definite descriptions. Definite descriptions are basically these quantifier phrases, and we can then embed them in other logical complexes. We don't have to believe in senses. All we have to believe in backwards E's and upside down A's. But the underlying sentences have these sorts of logical structures. And that makes everything make sense. At least in the relevant sense of sense. Before we turn to the last bit here, I'm going to ask, to overuse a phrase, does the Russellian picture broadly make sense? Again, the big thought is we're going to use these descriptive phrases, these definite descriptions. They're going to fill in, and once we start seeing names as those, all of our problems go away. Of course, not all of our problems. Right? So, Ramsey, who is probably the best analytic philosopher who ever lived, said that Russell's theory is a paradigm of philosophy. This is what all philosophy should aim for. And Ramsey thought this because it basically set up a new way to make progress for philosophical problems. And the new way wasn't, let's use descriptions. It was rather that, well, actually a lot of these problems might be products of bad language. Language that we can clarify by using various logical techniques. Put really bluntly, natural language sucks, formal languages rule. At least with regards to making things clear. And if you think that a bunch of these problems are problems of, say, syntax or ambiguity, then of course the formal tools are going to look lovely. As Russell says in his response to Strawson, I'm persuaded that common speech is full of vagueness and inaccuracy, and any attempt to be precise and accurate requires modification of common speech, both as regards vocabulary and as regards syntax. In philosophy, it's syntax, even more than vocabulary, that needs to be corrected. That is, these problems look like problems because we're misled by our surface grammar. Santa doesn't exist looks like a subject-predicate sentence, and that's why it's a problem. But if you realize the underlying structure isn't a subject-predicate one, it's in fact, if Russell's right, this big definite description-y thing with a negation in front, you can see how it makes sense and why it's true. And we don't need to posit anything like senses. That's really cool. That move to think about the underlying logical structure, regardless of how exactly we do, is something that's really useful. Right. Unfortunately, Russell's particular story doesn't get everything. I'm going to really quickly throw some of the issues at you. Here are 4 quick problems with Russell. First one has to do with what we might think of as incomplete definite descriptions. So take, the book is on the table. It seems pretty obvious that we can say something like this, and indeed it should come out true. But note, this and this, neither of them are actual definite descriptions. Is there only one book in existence? Is there only one table? So we have to understand what's going on here. This looks like it should be a true sentence, but on Russell's account, there's no way this comes out true. At least not simply as expressed. Because it tells us there's exactly one thing that's a book and exactly one thing that's a table, both of which are false. That's not too bad. Maybe we can use context to help us. Here's a worst case. Suppose we're at a party and we're talking about someone because, we're catty, right? And I say, the man in the corner drinking a martini is suspicious. Now, it seems like you would perfectly understand who I mean, even if it turns out that the dude in the corner isn't drinking a martini. Instead, he's just got water in a martini glass. So what's the problem here? It looks like I can use a description to pick someone out, even if they don't satisfy the description. The man in the corner drinking a martini. Cool. He doesn't have a martini. He's just got water. I still managed to talk about him. Do we see the problem? So if the way we're picking things out is by them satisfying the description, it looks like we can have instances where we pick something out even though it doesn't satisfy the description. He's in the corner, but he ain't drinking a martini. He's just got water. But we're still talking about him. We're still talking about how, really, I'm not sure that jacket goes with those shoes. Right? Pretty sus. You can see how this goes. So there seems to be a gap here. There seems to be a gap between what we might think of as speaker meaning, the person we're trying to pick out, versus semantic meaning, that is, whatever the sentence actually describes. The thing that actually fits the description that's embedded here. The problem is Russell's story and his given cannot account for that difference. Your response to the man in the corner drinking martini is sus should be, there's no such person. But that looks wrong. You might correct my description, but you wouldn't say, oh, that was just a failure. A similar kind of one, so that's a substantive problem. Russell needs to say more. Another problem is when we think about generics. So generics are somewhere in between single claims and universal claims. So mosquitoes carry West Nile virus. Well, that's not true of all mosquitoes. And in fact, it's actually true of very, very few mosquitoes, statistically. Or the whale is a mammal. We're not talking about a particular whale. This isn't Willie of Free Willy fame. It's kind of whales in general. But how to make sense of the whale here? Because this should be read as a definite description, according to Russell, and now we're right back into a problem very similar to this. Not terrible. The last two are the bad ones. Remember, Russell said, hey, what we're going to do with 99.9 of proper names is read them as definite descriptions. What about that last little bit? Russell does allow for some genuine names. They're what he calls logically proper names. The meaning of them is just a reference. In fact, he tends to think that the best ones, the only ones, might be something like this and that. Something we could define ostensibly. The problem is, we can run our puzzles using those. I might not be sure whether this is the same as that. Think about a Hesperus-phosphorus case. We point at a star, and I say, this is shiny. And then we point again in the morning and say, that is shiny. Cool. I should be able to just go straight through to the object that we've ostensibly denoted, but I can have substitution failures. I might think one is true and the other is false because I think we pointed at different things. So if some names really are names, we haven't gotten rid of all the puzzles yet. We've just pushed them into one little weird corner. But it's still there, and we still have to fix it. Let me just quickly mention the last thing. And this is Strawson's objection. Strawson's objection is effectively that Russell has got the whole notion of definite descriptions wrong. Put really bluntly, he thinks Frege's story about there being truth-value gaps is much better than Russell's story, where the present king of France's bald comes out false. So what we'll do, we'll talk more about this next time, because I think it's important for us to kind of get a grip on how Strawson's objection goes and why it works. But what we're going to also talk about how you have the run. So Frege and Russell disagree about a lot of things, but they broadly agree on one, which is that whatever singular terms are, they work roughly by description, either through senses to then get us to reference, or because they just are concealed descriptions. So this idea that singular terms are descriptions or contain descriptions is a kind of called the Russell-Frege view of singular terms, or descriptivism. And the topic for next time is the demolition of descriptivism. What we're going to do is raise 3 problems. And they're problems that it looks like on a purely descriptivist theory of singular terms, we cannot make sense of it all. So this is what Kripke is probably most famous for. We'll talk about these problems, and we'll talk about the story that arises in face of the failures of descriptivism. This is Kripke's causal theory. And we'll wrap up by talking about some lingering issues, problems with both Frege-Russell views and the million story that Kripke gives us. So with regards to reading, again, I've said read 1 and 2. My suggestion, just read 2. It starts off with a little survey about what happens in 1, and it's pretty straightforward. But if you have the time, read them both, because it's really cool. Cool. Thank you guys very much for coming. Have a lovely week. And yeah, we'll see you all next Tuesday.